"Step outside, ma'am, now." The command cut through the quiet like a blade made of authority, cold and absolute, and for a moment, even the night seemed to hold its breath. Danielle Carter stood just inside her front door, fingers still wrapped around the strap of her worn hospital bag, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to her scrubs, her body carrying the weight of a 12-hour shift that had not once allowed her to sit, let alone rest. The porch light cast a soft amber glow across the narrow hallway behind her, warm and familiar, a stark contrast to the pulsing red and blue reflections that bled through her curtains, flickering across the walls like a warning she hadn't asked for. Outside, engines idled low and steady, a mechanical chorus that filled the silence of the suburban street, and when she glanced through the small window beside the door, the sight didn't register all at once. It came in pieces, fragments her mind struggled to assemble into something real. One cruiser, then 3, then more, until the number stopped making sense. 10 police cars, their lights painting her home in urgency, their presence swallowing the quiet neighborhood whole. A figure stepped forward from the line, tall, rigid, his silhouette outlined by the flashing lights behind him, and even through the glass, Danielle could feel the weight of his stare, the kind that didn't ask questions, only delivered conclusions. "Officer Mark Reynolds." His voice came again, louder this time, sharper, practiced. "We're not asking again." Somewhere down the block, a door creaked open. Then another. Shadows shifted behind windows. Phones lifted, tiny glowing rectangles capturing a moment that had already begun to twist out of her control. Danielle exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her like something measured, deliberate, the way she had learned to do in emergency rooms when everything around her moved too fast and someone else's panic tried to become her own. Her heart was beating, yes, but steady, grounded. She set her bag down gently against the wall, careful, almost ritualistic, as if placing it there anchored her to something real, something that still belonged to her. The fabric of her. Scrubs brushed softly as she straightened, her shoulders rolling back just enough to remind her body that it was still hers, that this moment, no matter how loud or overwhelming, did not get to define her. Outside, Reynolds shifted his stance, impatience bleeding into every line of his posture. The officers behind him stood ready, not chaotic, not frantic, just certain. Certain they were in the right place. Certain they had the right person. Certain she was the problem that needed solving. Danielle's eyes lingered on the reflection in the glass. Her own face, faint beneath the strobing lights, tired but unbroken. 12 hours ago, she had been the one people looked to for answers, for calm, for life. Now, she was something else entirely in their eyes. Suspicion, a situation, a target of procedure. She reached for the doorknob but didn't turn it. Not yet. Instead, she spoke, her voice steady, clear, carrying just enough to reach beyond the wood and glass without rising into fear. "You're going to tell me why you're here." There was a pause, brief but heavy, the kind that stretched just long enough to reveal the truth hiding underneath authority. Because this wasn't about urgency. It wasn't about danger. It was about assumption. An assumption had already made its decision before she ever opened the door. Danielle did not move right away, and that stillness seemed to confuse them more than defiance ever could, because it was not resistance, it was control, and control did not fit the version of her they had already decided on. Her hand rested lightly against the cool metal of the doorknob, but her eyes stayed fixed on the figure outside, measuring not just his words but the space between them, the hesitation that lingered just a fraction too long before he answered. "We received a report," Reynolds said finally, his voice flattening into something procedural, stripped of tone, as if the explanation itself was enough to justify everything that followed. A report. The word hung there, vague and heavy, offering no shape, no detail, only weight. Danielle let it settle without interrupting, her gaze steady, her breathing even, the same quiet discipline she used when a patient's condition began to turn and everyone else in the room started to panic. She had learned long ago that clarity did not come from noise. It came from waiting. Outside, another officer shifted, his radio crackling softly at his shoulder, the sound cutting through the night like static against glass. Somewhere to the left, a car door opened and closed again, and the faint murmur of voices carried across the lawn, low and uncertain, as neighbors leaned closer to their windows, drawn by the spectacle unfolding just feet from where they slept. Danielle could feel their presence without seeing them, the invisible audience that always appeared when something did not belong, when something looked out of place. And right now, she was the thing that did not belong in their eyes. A black woman in scrubs, standing alone in a modest home, surrounded by authority that had already decided she required explanation. She finally turned the knob, but only halfway, just enough for the latch to release without opening the door fully, creating a narrow space between her and the outside world, a boundary that was both physical and intentional. The night air slipped in, cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and engine heat, and with it, the full presence of the officers waiting beyond her porch. "What kind of report?" she asked, her voice calm, unshaken, each word placed carefully, not raised, not softened, simply stated. Reynolds stepped closer, boots pressing lightly against the concrete, his expression tightening as if the question itself was inconvenient. "Suspicious activity," he replied, and this time, the words came quicker, practiced, familiar, the kind of answer that closed doors rather than opened them. Danielle tilted her head slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition. Suspicious. Another word without edges, without accountability, a label that could stretch to fit whatever story needed telling. Her fingers loosened from the knob as she let the silence return, giving his answer the same space she had given the first. Inside, the soft hum of her refrigerator continued its steady rhythm, a small, ordinary sound that felt almost distant compared to the weight gathering outside her door. 12 hours ago, she had stood in a brightly lit room, guiding a stranger back from the edge of something irreversible, her voice the one people trusted, her presence the one that brought order to chaos. Now, under the flicker of patrol lights, she was being asked to justify her own existence in her own home. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She simply held her ground, her posture quiet but unyielding, her eyes never leaving Reynolds as she spoke again, softer this time, but somehow stronger for it. "You are going to need more than that." And in the space that followed, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, because for the first time since the lights arrived, the certainty on the other side of the door did not feel quite as solid as it had before. Reynolds did not answer right away, and that pause stretched just long enough to expose something beneath the uniform, something less certain than the authority he carried on his shoulders, because for the first time, the situation was not moving in the direction he expected. His jaw tightened slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied Danielle through the narrow opening of the door, as if recalculating, as if trying to fit her composure into a narrative that had already been written without her input. "Ma'am," he said again, slower this time, each word pressed down with more intention. "We have reason to believe there may be unauthorized activity linked to this residence." The phrasing shifted, more formal, more deliberate, but still just as vague, still just as distant from anything concrete. Danielle let the words settle, her expression unchanged, but inside, something sharpened, not fear, not anger, but clarity, the kind that came when pieces that did not belong together were forced into the same space. Unauthorized activity. Suspicious report. 10 patrol units. The scale did not match the substance, and she knew that instinctively, the same way she could tell when a patient's symptoms did not align with the diagnosis on the chart. Outside, the flashing lights continued to pulse, reflecting off the polished surface of Reynolds' badge, turning it into something almost abstract, a symbol more than an identity. Behind him, one of the younger officers shifted his weight again, glancing briefly toward the neighboring houses, where silhouettes had begun to gather more openly now, drawn by the spectacle, by the unspoken question of what could possibly justify this level of attention. Danielle noticed the movement, not because she was looking for it, but because she was trained to see everything, to read a room even when that room was a front yard filled with uniforms and assumptions. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the door, no longer gripping, no longer bracing, just present, steady, as she leaned slightly forward, closing the distance by an inch, not enough to step outside, but enough to make it clear she was not retreating either. "You said unauthorized," she replied, her voice even, controlled. "Then you can tell me what exactly you think is happening here." There was no accusation in her tone, no escalation, only a request for definition, for something that could be examined, questioned, understood. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, the sound barely audible but sharp enough to signal irritation, because this was not how these encounters usually went. Usually, the door opened wider. Usually, the voice on the other side carried confusion, defensiveness, or fear. Usually, the situation moved quickly, predictably, toward compliance. But Danielle was not giving him that. She was giving him space to explain, and in doing so, she was quietly shifting the weight of the moment back onto him. "We can discuss that once you step outside," he said, attempting to regain ground, his tone tightening again, returning to command rather than conversation. Danielle did not move. The air between them held steady, unchanged, the boundary still intact. Inside her home, the clock on the wall ticked softly, each second marking time that felt both slow and deliberate, as if the night itself was waiting to see what would happen next. She thought briefly of the hospital room she had left less than an hour ago, the controlled environment, the structured chaos that always followed rules, even when those rules were stretched. Out here, the rules felt different, more flexible, more dependent on perception than fact. She met Reynolds' gaze fully now, not challenging, not yielding, simply present in a way that made avoidance impossible. "No," she said quietly, the word landing without force but with certainty. "We are not doing that." The officers behind him exchanged brief glances, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that something had shifted again, because refusal without agitation was unfamiliar territory. Danielle's posture remained unchanged, her presence calm but anchored, as she added, just as steady. "If you have a warrant, you can show it. If you do not, you can explain why 10 cars are outside my house at midnight." The words did not rise in volume, but they carried weight, not from emotion, but from truth. And for the first time since the lights had filled the street, the question of who controlled this moment no longer had an obvious answer. The silence that followed her refusal did not explode into chaos. It thickened, dense and uncomfortable, pressing in on the space between them like humidity before a storm that had not yet decided to break. And for a brief moment, no one moved. Not Reynolds, not the officers behind him, not even the neighbors watching from behind half-open doors and dimly lit windows. Danielle remained exactly where she was, framed by the narrow opening of her doorway, the warm light behind her outlining a life that was ordinary, structured, earned, a life that did not match the scene unfolding outside. Reynolds shifted his stance again, slower this time, as if aware that every movement was now being observed not just by his team, but by the woman in front of him who had refused to step into the script he expected her to follow. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, his tone lowering, not louder, but heavier, carrying the implication that compliance would have made everything simpler, cleaner, faster. Danielle did not respond immediately, and that pause was not hesitation, it was intention, the kind that forced his words to hang in the air long enough to be examined for what they really were. She tilted her head, slightly, her eyes steady, not confrontational, but unwavering in a way that made it impossible to dismiss her as emotional or reactive. "No," she said quietly, "I am making it clear." The distinction settled between them, subtle but sharp, because clarity required truth, and truth required something more than assumptions wrapped in authority. Behind Reynolds, one of the officers glanced down at a tablet, scrolling briefly before leaning in to murmur something low, too quiet for the neighbors, but not quiet enough to escape Danielle's notice. She did not hear the words, but she saw the shift, the slight tightening in Reynolds' shoulders, the way his posture adjusted as if the ground beneath him had become less certain. Somewhere to the right, a porch light flicked on across the street, illuminating a middle-aged couple standing side by side, arms crossed, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern, their presence another reminder that this moment was no longer contained. It was public, visible, undeniable. Danielle let her gaze move briefly past Reynolds, taking in the scene not as someone overwhelmed by it, but as someone documenting it, storing details the way she had learned to do in rooms where every second mattered. 10 vehicles, multiple officers, no visible warrant, a vague report, and now hesitation. She brought her focus back to Reynolds, her voice still calm, still measured, but carrying something firmer now, something rooted deeper than the moment itself. You said you have reason, she continued. Then you can state it. Right here, right now. There was no raised volume, no demand for escalation, just a direct line drawn between authority and accountability. Reynolds exhaled again, longer this time, his gaze flicking briefly to the side, as if searching for support that did not immediately present itself. The officers behind him remained still, but their stillness had changed, less certain, more watchful, as if they too were waiting for something that had not yet arrived. We do not conduct investigations on the front lawn, he replied, attempting to reclaim control through procedure, through the idea that there was a correct place and time for answers, and that this was not it. Danielle's expression did not shift, but something in her eyes sharpened, not anger, not frustration, but recognition, the quiet understanding of a boundary being used not to protect, but to avoid. Then you should not have brought the investigation to my front lawn, she said, just as evenly, the words landing without force, but leaving no space to ignore their meaning. The air seemed to still again, heavier now, because the logic was simple, undeniable, and it did not rely on emotion to hold its weight. A faint buzz came from Reynolds' radio, a voice breaking through with clipped urgency, and though the words were not fully clear, the tone was enough to shift his attention for a fraction of a second. Danielle noticed that too. She noticed everything. The flicker of distraction, the tightening grip on control, the subtle fracture in certainty. And in that space, she did something small, almost unremarkable, but deliberate. She stepped back half a step, not retreating, but repositioning, her hand leaving the doorknob as she reached instead for the small table just inside the entryway where her phone rested, the screen dark, waiting. She did not pick it up yet. She simply let her fingers rest near it, her gaze returning to Reynolds, calm as ever, her voice soft but unmistakably resolved. You are standing outside my home without a warrant, she said, each word precise, grounded. And you are asking me to make your job easier by stepping into uncertainty. I am not going to do that. The statement did not escalate the situation. It clarified it, drawing a line that was no longer about compliance, but about principle. And for the first time since the lights had filled the street, the balance of control felt like it was shifting in a direction no one outside that door had planned for. The air did not break. It tightened, coiling slowly around the moment, as if every second stretched longer than it should, and Danielle could feel it in the way the officers shifted, in the way the silence no longer felt controlled but uncertain, like something waiting for direction that had not yet been given. Reynolds' eyes flicked briefly toward her, hand resting near the phone, and that small movement said more than his words ever could, because now he understood that the situation was no longer one-sided, no longer something he could steer with tone and presence alone. Ma'am, he said again, but this time the word carried less certainty, less command, and more strain, as if he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping. We are trying to resolve this quickly. Danielle did not pick up the phone, not yet, and that restraint mattered, because it showed that she was not reacting, she was deciding, and decision carried weight that reaction never could. Her eyes remained steady on him, her posture unchanged, her voice quiet but anchored in something deeper than the moment unfolding outside her door. Then you should start with the truth, she replied, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any raised voice could have, because truth required specificity, and specificity was exactly what had been missing since the first knock. Behind Reynolds, the faint glow of a body camera caught the angle of the doorway, capturing her silhouette, her stillness, the controlled way she held herself in the face of something that was meant to overwhelm. Somewhere farther down the street, a car slowed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the scene before continuing on, a silent acknowledgement that something unusual was happening here, something that did not belong in an ordinary night. Danielle could feel the weight of being watched, not just by the officers, but by everyone who had chosen to witness instead of look away, and she knew what that meant, because visibility changed everything. It forced accountability into spaces where it was often avoided. Reynolds took a step closer, just one, careful, measured, but it was enough to signal that he was trying to regain ground, trying to reassert a control that no longer felt automatic. We received multiple reports, he said, adding detail now, but still not enough, still circling the center without naming it. And we are following protocol. Danielle's gaze did not waver, and for a moment, the word protocol seemed to echo between them, hollow in a way that exposed how easily it could be used to justify almost anything. She had heard that word before, in different rooms, under different lights, sometimes used correctly, sometimes used to hide mistakes. She knew the difference. Protocol requires cause, she said softly, not correcting him, not challenging him, simply stating a fact that did not need to be raised to be heard. And cause requires evidence. The officers behind him shifted again, more noticeably now, their attention no longer fixed entirely forward, some glancing sideways, some looking down, small fractures in the uniform stillness that had defined their presence when they first arrived. Danielle noticed every one of them, not because she was looking for weakness, but because she understood patterns, and this pattern was changing. Her fingers moved slightly, brushing the edge of the phone, not gripping it, not lifting it, just acknowledging its presence, the option it represented, the shift it could create if she chose to act. Inside the house, the quiet remained unchanged, the steady hum of ordinary life continuing as if it existed in a different world entirely, one untouched by flashing lights and raised expectations. That contrast grounded her, reminded her that this moment, as loud as it felt, did not define the entirety of who she was. Reynolds' radio crackled again, louder this time, and though the words were still not fully clear, the tone carried urgency that did not match the calm he was trying to maintain. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering for just a second, and in that second, Danielle saw it clearly, the gap between authority and certainty, the place where control began to fracture. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She simply stood there, present, unwavering, her voice steady as she spoke again, each word deliberate, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. You came here with 10 cars, she said, and you still cannot tell me why. The sentence did not accuse, it revealed, and in doing so, it shifted the weight of the moment entirely, because now the question was no longer about her. It was about them, about the justification that had not yet been provided, about the space between power and responsibility that was becoming harder to ignore with every passing second. The night seemed to settle into a strange kind of stillness, not peaceful, not calm, but suspended, as if everything was waiting for something unseen to tip the balance one way or the other, and Danielle could feel it in her chest, not as fear, but as a quiet pressure, the kind that came when a moment stretched beyond what it was supposed to hold. The flashing lights no longer felt urgent, they felt repetitive, almost hollow, cycling through red and blue across her walls, across the faces outside, across the uncertainty that had begun to replace confidence. Reynolds did not respond immediately this time, and that silence carried more weight than any answer he could have given, because it confirmed what Danielle already understood, that whatever had brought them here was not solid enough to stand on its own. A faint breeze moved through the open space of the doorway, brushing lightly against her skin, carrying with it the distant sound of leaves shifting somewhere down the block, a soft, ordinary sound that felt almost out of place against the tension gathered on her porch. She let her hand finally rest fully on the phone, her fingers curling around it with slow intention, not rushed, not reactive, just deliberate, as if she had already made the decision long before this moment arrived. Outside, one of the officers lowered his gaze, another adjusted his stance again, and the pattern of movement had changed from readiness to uncertainty, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that did not need to be announced to be felt. Danielle drew in a steady breath, her shoulders rising just slightly before settling again, grounding herself in the same way she had done countless times before when everything around her threatened to escalate beyond control. She was not thinking about them anymore, not about Reynolds or the cars or the watching neighbors. She was thinking about alignment, about truth, about the line that had already been crossed without justification. Her thumb brushed across the dark screen, waking it, the soft glow illuminating her hand for just a moment. A quiet contrast to the harsh lights outside. Reynolds noticed. Of course he did. His posture shifted instantly, not aggressive, not forward, but alert, as if something small had suddenly become significant, as if the situation had just moved beyond his immediate reach. "Ma'am," he started again, but the word came slower this time, less certain, and whatever he intended to say next did not fully form, because now he was reacting, not leading. Danielle did not look away from him as she unlocked the phone, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, her voice calm in a way that felt almost detached from the chaos surrounding her. "You have asked me to trust a process that you cannot explain," she said quietly, each word clear, measured, carrying no anger, only truth, "and that is not something I am going to do." The statement did not escalate anything, it clarified everything, drawing a line that was no longer negotiable. She lowered her gaze just enough to find the contact she needed, her thumb hovering for the briefest moment before pressing it, the action simple, controlled, final in a way that did not need to be dramatic to carry weight. The phone lifted to her ear, her posture unchanged, her eyes returning to Reynolds as if nothing about her stance had shifted at all. For a second, there was nothing but the quiet connection of the call, a soft tone that only she could hear, a small sound in a moment that felt otherwise too large. Then, when the line opened, her voice softened slightly, not weaker, but warmer, grounded in familiarity, in certainty that existed outside the tension of the street. "Hey," she said, calm, steady. "I need you to come take a look at something." She did not explain further. She did not need to. And somehow, that made the moment heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because now there was something coming that they could not predict, something that did not belong to their structure, their assumptions, or their control. Danielle lowered the phone slightly, not ending the call, just holding it there, her gaze steady on Reynolds, her presence unchanged, but the atmosphere around her had shifted completely, because the waiting was no longer one-sided, and for the first time since the lights had filled the street, the uncertainty belonged to everyone. The line stayed open in Danielle's hand, quiet but present, a connection that did not need words to carry meaning. And for a few seconds, nothing around her changed, not the lights, not the stance of the officers, not the watchful silence of the neighbors, but something beneath it all had shifted, subtle and irreversible, like a current turning under still water. Reynolds watched her closely now, not with the same rigid certainty he had arrived with, but with something more measured, more cautious, as if he was beginning to understand that the situation in front of him was no longer contained within the boundaries he had expected. "Who did you call?" he asked, and this time the question was not a command. It was a need for information, a small but undeniable change in tone that did not go unnoticed. Danielle did not answer immediately, and that pause carried weight again, not as resistance, but as choice, because she was no longer responding to pressure. She was allowing the moment to unfold on terms that made sense. The faint sound of an approaching engine reached the edge of the street, distant at first, barely noticeable against the idle hum of the patrol cars, but it grew steadily, not loud, not aggressive, just consistent, purposeful. A low, unfamiliar rhythm that did not match the pattern already established by the line of police vehicles. One of the officers turned his head slightly, listening, then another, until the attention that had been fixed entirely on Danielle began to fracture, drawn outward towards something none of them had planned for. Reynolds glanced over his shoulder, just briefly, but it was enough to show that the center of control was no longer anchored where he stood. Danielle remained exactly where she was, the phone still near her ear, her expression unchanged, her posture grounded, as if she had already moved beyond the uncertainty that was now beginning to ripple through the line of officers outside. The sound grew closer, the steady roll of tires against pavement, and then headlights appeared. At the far end of the block, not flashing, not urgent, just clean and direct, cutting through the red and blue with a calm white beam that did not compete, it replaced. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately, not weaving through the scene, but approaching it as if it belonged there just as much as anything else already present. Conversations that had been murmured among the neighbors fell silent, attention shifting fully now, because something about this arrival felt different, not louder, but heavier, like it carried a kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. The car came to a stop a few houses down, engine idling for a brief second before shutting off completely, and in that quiet, the contrast became unmistakable. because the flashing lights still pulsed, but they no longer dominated the space the way they had moments before. A door opened, not slammed, not rushed, just a controlled movement, and a figure stepped out, tall, composed, moving with the kind of confidence that came not from performance, but from certainty. No uniform marked him in the way the others were marked, but there was no mistaking the shift his presence created. One of the officers straightened instinctively. Another adjusted his stance. Reynolds turned fully now, his attention pulled away from Danielle for the first time since the encounter began, his posture tightening in a way that was different from before, not assertive, but aware. Danielle lowered the phone slightly, her voice soft but clear as she spoke into it. "I see you." And then she ended the call, not abruptly, but with finality, as if the conversation had already served its purpose. She looked back at Reynolds, her expression steady, unchanged, but the air between them was no longer the same, because now there was context, now there was something present that could not be dismissed as assumption or speculation. The figure walked forward at an even pace, closing the distance without hurry, without hesitation, and as he stepped into the glow of the patrol lights, faces began to register recognition, not loudly, not spoken, but visible in the small, involuntary shifts of posture and attention. Danielle did not move. She did not need to, because whatever had just arrived was not here to escalate the situation. It was here to reveal it, and for the first time since the night began, the truth was no longer something she had to hold alone. The man did not raise his voice when he reached the edge of the driveway, and somehow that made the shift even more immediate, because authority that does not need volume carries a different kind of weight, the kind that settles into a room without asking permission. His boots met the pavement with quiet precision, each step measured, controlled, and as he moved into full view beneath the wash of red and blue lights, the details became clearer, the posture, the bearing, the unmistakable calm of someone who had spent a lifetime walking into situations that did not belong to him and leaving them changed. Commander Jason Hayes did not look at Danielle first. His eyes went straight to Reynolds. That alone was enough to alter the balance. "Officer," he said, his tone even, not confrontational, but firm in a way that left no room for dismissal. "I am going to need an explanation." There was no introduction, no request for permission to speak, just a direct line drawn between presence and accountability. Reynolds straightened slightly, instinctively, as if responding to a hierarchy that had not been formally stated but was clearly understood. "Sir," he began, but the word came slower than expected, carrying a hesitation that had not been there before. "We are responding to a report of suspicious activity." Hayes did not nod. He did not acknowledge the statement as sufficient. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, waiting, and that silence did what no interruption could have done. It required more. "And the nature of that activity?" he asked, just as calmly, the question simple, but impossible to answer with anything vague. Reynolds hesitated, and this time the pause was longer, more visible, because now the expectation was different. Now the answer had to hold under scrutiny, not just under authority. "We are still determining that," he replied, the words careful, controlled, but lacking the certainty they were meant to convey. Hayes let the silence return again, not as pressure, but as space, the kind that reveals what is missing. Then he turned, finally, to Danielle. The shift was subtle, but it mattered, because when he looked at her, it was not with suspicion, not with assumption, but with recognition, not of who she was in title, but of what she carried in presence. "You called," he said, his voice softer now, still steady, but grounded in familiarity. Danielle nodded once, her posture unchanged, her voice calm. "Yes." There was no need for elaboration, no need to explain what he had already begun to understand simply by being there. Hayes turned back to Reynolds, and this time there was a slight change in his expression, not anger, not frustration, but something closer to disappointment, the kind that comes when a situation does not meet the standard it should have upheld. "You brought 10 units to a private residence," he said, each word measured, deliberate, without a clear articulation of cause, without a warrant, and without de-escalation. The statement was not loud, but it landed with precision, because it did not accuse, it documented. Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but nothing immediate came, and in that moment, The absence of explanation became louder than any defense could have been. Behind him, the officers remained still, but their stillness had shifted again, no longer uncertain, but aware that the situation had moved beyond routine, beyond assumption, into something that required accountability. Danielle watched quietly, not stepping forward, not inserting herself, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about the truth revealing itself without her needing to carry it alone. Hayes took one small step closer, not aggressive, not imposing, but enough to close the distance between expectation and responsibility. You do not get to expand your authority because something feels out of place, he continued, his tone unchanged. You justify it with facts. The words settled into the space between them, clear, undeniable, and for the first time since the night began, the structure that had surrounded Danielle was no longer pressing inward, it was being examined from the outside, and under that examination, it was beginning to show exactly what it was made of. No one spoke right away after that, and the silence that settled over the driveway was no longer tense in the same way it had been before. It was different now, heavier but clearer, like a room after the truth has already been said and there is nothing left to hide behind. Reynolds' shoulders dropped just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to signal something internal had shifted, something that could not be corrected with another explanation or another attempt at control. He glanced briefly at the line of patrol cars, then back at Hayes, and for the first time since the night began, his voice carried something that had not been there before. "We received a call," he said, quieter now, more grounded. A neighbor reported unusual activity, said it did not look right. The words were simple, stripped of the authority they had been wrapped in earlier, and in that simplicity, the truth became easier to see. Hayes did not interrupt. He let the explanation stand on its own, let it be heard exactly as it was, without pressure, without correction. "And you escalated based on that alone," he replied, not as a question, but as a conclusion drawn from the facts already presented. Reynolds did not answer, but he did not need to, because the absence of a response confirmed everything. Behind him, one of the officers shifted his weight again. Another reached up to adjust his radio, small movements that now felt less like readiness and more like awareness, like recognition that something about this moment would stay with them long after the lights were gone. Danielle remained in the doorway, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but her eyes softened just slightly, not in relief, but in understanding, because this was never about proving she was right. It was about allowing the truth to exist in a space where it had not been given room before. Hayes took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space again, returning the moment to something closer to balance. "Then you correct it," he said calmly, his voice even, carrying no anger, only expectation. "You do not double down on it." The instruction was simple, direct, and it left no ambiguity about what came next. Reynolds nodded once, the movement controlled, deliberate, as if acknowledging not just the words, but the weight behind them. He turned slightly, addressing the officers behind him with a quiet directive that did not need to be loud to be understood, and one by one, the tension that had filled the driveway began to release. Engines shut off, doors closed with softer sounds. The flashing lights dimmed as switches were flipped, red and blue fading into the natural darkness of the street, replaced by the steady glow of porch lights and street lamps that had been there all along. The neighbors did not disappear immediately, but their posture changed, less rigid, less drawn forward, as if the scene they had been watching had resolved into something they could finally understand. Danielle stepped back just enough to close the door halfway, not shutting it completely, but reclaiming the boundary that had been tested, her hand resting lightly against the wood as she watched the last of the officers begin to step away from her lawn. Reynolds lingered for a moment longer, then turned back toward her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer certain, but something quieter, more human. "Ma'am," he said, the word different now, not a command, not a label, but an acknowledgement. This should not have happened. Danielle met his gaze, her expression calm, her voice steady, carrying no trace of bitterness, only truth. "Then make sure it does not again," she replied, and the simplicity of it held more weight than any accusation could have. Reynolds nodded once more, then turned away, the distance between them closing not with words, but with action as he moved back toward the remaining vehicles. Hayes remained where he was for a moment, his presence steady, his gaze briefly returning to Danielle, not with formality, but with quiet respect. She gave a small nod in return, nothing dramatic, nothing performative, just acknowledgement, and that was enough. He turned and walked back toward his car, his steps as measured as when he arrived, his presence, leaving the space as calmly as it had entered it. The street returned to itself slowly, the sounds of engines fading into the distance, the lights settling back into something natural, something ordinary. Danielle closed the door the rest of the way, the soft click of the latch final, but not heavy, just complete. Inside, the quiet wrapped around her again, familiar, grounding, untouched by what had just unfolded outside. She stood there for a moment, her hand still resting against the door, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. Then she turned, picking up her bag from the floor, the fabric brushing softly against her leg as she moved down the hallway, the warm light following her, leaving behind a porch that was once again still. Outside, the last of the red and blue disappeared at the end of the street, and in their place, there was only the quiet, steady presence of a neighborhood returning to itself, and the kind of